the small town of Tomskog, Minnesota, there were 4 handcuffed people lined against a wall. The room smelled of stale morning dew, and the walls were lined with soldered sheet metal, rusted and forgotten since the early 70s. The 4 people had been there for several hours, but the sedatives had kept them blissfully unaware. As an old door creaked to life, a man entered the room. He was dressed in a green plastic poncho with a burlap sack covering his face.
Rise and shine.
He sighed.
Let's begin.
With the flick of a wrist, he lit a road flare. A sparkling red shine burst to life, jolting the 4 people awake. One by one, they found their bearings, their heads lolling back and forth. The room was oppressively small. The air was stale and tainted with rust. There was a slight pressure in their ears. They might be underground. The man in the burlap sack dropped the flare on the floor and walked up to one of them. He offered them a merciful splash of water from a canteen, and no one dared to refuse. Ice-cold spring water. He stepped back, taking in the sights of these 4, to the spattering of the road flare.
I need to know which one of you is Emmett Rask.
He said. A strange question. Emmett August Rask had been dead for over a century, an obscure man who never managed to strike a large audience with his varied works of plays, novels, and bedtime stories. There were even a few non-fiction stream of consciousness type books called The Diaries of Emmett Rask out there, focusing mainly on his delirious nighttime philosophies, but they didn't have much of a following. But these 4 people had a peculiar connection to Emmett Rask, and the man in the burlap sack knew this. He stepped up to the man on the far left, keeping him at arm's reach.
Are you Emmett Rask?
He asked. The man on the far left was Leonard Emmett, 24 years old, plucked from an underground party at the southern docks as he went outside to take a piss. Leonard had found success online by producing short videos based on the works of Rask. One film had garnered over 2 million views and portrayed the struggle of a man trying to break the cycle of violence brought on by his abusive stepfather. The stepfather was symbolized with an ever-present eye in the sky, an obvious metaphor of a god complex. In Emmett's adaptation, however, this was symbolized with an addiction to smartphones. I don't see how. What do you want from me? Leonard stammered. The man in the burlap sack observed him for a few seconds. When it became evident that there'd be no answer, he flicked his wrist and produced a handgun. Moments later, a shot rang out in the hollow metal room, deafening the 3 remaining captives. Leonard's blood looked just like water in the red light of the flare. He looked soot-covered rather than shot. The remaining prisoners squirmed and tossed against their chains, but these were custom-fitted to suit them. There would be no escape. "What the fuck are you doing?" cried the second prisoner.
He wasn't Emmett Rask.
The man in the burlap sack said.
Are you?
The second prisoner was the award-winning novelist Lawrence St. John. That he was put among these relative nobodies was nothing short of a disgrace. This was a man that toured the world countless times over his 30-year career, taking much of his inspiration from early 20th century writers. And yet, he hung from the chains just like everyone else, kidnapped as he'd stepped into a luxurious taxi with a seemingly adoring fan. "Anyone can be Emmett Rask," Lawrence said. "That's a central theme in most of his work, the idea that the identity is transferable, transcendent."
Explain,
demanded the man in the burlap mask. It's information. It can't die, and since we are information, we can't. Lawrence paused. He couldn't think as he stared down the barrel of a gun. His mind locked itself in a corner, forcing him into a mental fetal position. He wavered between the talking points of his recent tour and the desperate pleadings of a death-threatened man. The man with the burlap sack, however, didn't care either way. He just pulled the trigger. Lawrence joined Emmett as they both hung their hands down below. The shot echoed back and forth, causing the sheet metal walls to hum and dance. The remaining two people tried to blink away the pain in their ears, but there was nothing to be done. Pain was going to take its toll, whether they wanted it or not. Next in line was Sarah Wilson, playwright and director at a community theater in downtown Mankato. Her thick glasses had rolled off the bridge of her nose during her unconscious state, and she couldn't see any details of her assailant through the fog of her glaucoma. And yet, when the barrel of the gun tilted her way, she stood up, straight and proud. She was perhaps the most familiar with the works of Emmett Rask, and she could gab with the best of them.
Are you Emmett Rask?
The man with the burlap sack said.
I could be.
She said.
But what makes you think I would tell you if I were?
Because if you don't, I will murder you.
He responded.
What is a body to an immortal?
She smiled.
Explain.
Emmett Rask had the idea that the very essence of a person could be distilled into a select and compact set of words. While genes might be our physical building blocks, determining our physiological being, it is the information we perceive that shape our minds. Sarah knew this, as it was a central theme in her rendition of Rask's play, The Hatchetman.
Rask believed that all language was derivative of a core principle, that we taught ourselves language not only to warn others of danger, but to immortalize ourselves.
True,
said the man in the burlap sack.
but does that make you him?
Any person who has studied his work for any period of time carries a piece of him.
She continued.
I have studied him extensively. If I am not him presently, I can become him.
So, in conclusion, you are not currently Emmett Rask.
Sarah held her breath, feeling the warmth of the gun. She looked at the prisoner to her left, a vague shadow stirring to wake. A sudden anxiousness blossomed in her chest, the realization that this was really happening. This might be the actual, final end. It could be a matter of seconds. She tasted the metal, perhaps from the rusted walls.
How would you know if anyone is Emmett Rask?
She said.
There could be hundreds of people studying his work in one way or another. If you are so convinced that he is out there, what makes you think he is one of us?
I don't.
The man in the burlap sack answered.
I will keep killing until I find him.
There had been the mysterious disappearance of Halen Murray, a librarian of the Livingston Lord Library, Patrick Engold, who'd been murdered during a home invasion, Johann Dahlin, an exchange student who disappeared on his way back to his dormitory. They had all been avid Rask enthusiasts, and they had all met their fate at the hands of the same man, with the same burlap sack.
Do you think they are Rask?
Sarah asked, leaning her head toward the remaining prisoner.
They haven't said a word. Do you take Rask to be a talkative man or a quiet one?
The man in the burlap sack paused. It was a good question.
Would I even know if I was him? The transformation can, in theory, be gradual.
Explain.
And Sarah explained. In the diaries of Emmett Rask, he rambled about the immortality of the soul and the transference of identity. It was a theme in everything he did in an effort to immortalize himself. It was said that if one were to experience everything he'd written, one would be so enamored with him that they would, in time, actually become him.
I have read the plays, I have studied the diaries, I have transcribed his novels, and I've reviewed his work countless times,
shouted Sarah.
For you to point that tool at me and demand me to explain myself is beyond.
A third shot rang out as Sarah Wilson joined her peers. Her blood painted the rusted wall. The fourth and final prisoner hung her head, gently rocking themselves awake. Perhaps the sedatives had taken a greater hold than the man in the burlap sack had expected. He sighed, another batch of prisoners, and they were all useless meat. He imagined the many nights ahead when he would have to get rid of the bodies, to burn his clothes and erase all trace of them ever being here. It would be daunting physical labor, like all the other nights, exhausting. The fourth prisoner raised her head.
She forgot.
The prisoner said.
She forgot the children's books.
Hannah Blanchett was, by far, the youngest of the lot. At age 21, she had just started her career making books for children. Some of her early work was heavily inspired by Rask, and she was quite open about it in the few interviews she'd made. But she was far from a scholar or an enthusiast.
Is that bad?
The man in the burlap sack asked.
It's the purest form,
said Hannah.
the purest form of storytelling.
It's just bedtime stories about foxes, frogs, and dragons. How can that be pure?
It's not the stories themselves, but how you tell them.
Hannah continued.
They are told with love to an attentive audience. How many times in your life has someone actually read the Little Red Riding Hood to you?
I don't know.
Yet you know the story by heart, but can you remember the headline of yesterday's newspaper?
Hannah shook herself awake and stood up straight. She tried to blink the sleep out of her eyes, but the red flare was only making things worse. She gave up with a sigh.
It's in the children's books that the essence of his being is transmitted,
she said.
In the frogs, the foxes, and the dragons, that's where he tells his true wants and loves and lessons.
So then, are you Emmett Rask?
He asked. There was a part of Hannah that wanted to say yes. She wanted to scream it, to convince this madman that she was someone she wasn't, but she really couldn't. She knew who she was, sure. She'd been read those stories as a kid, but maybe she hadn't picked up on the true meaning. Maybe she'd fallen asleep on the punchline one time too many, lulled to sleep by her father's silky voice. But she thought about it, and there was something there. In the back of her mind, a thought gnawed, a thought like an old scar that had been burned into her soul, only to chafe when remembered. She picked at it.
Language,
she said.
That's what made Rask into what he was.
That goes without saying.
Scoffed the man in the burlap sack.
You can read that on the summary of his books.
Not just fucking words, you fucking dolt.
She spat.
The language of touch, taste, smell, sight, and sound. Fucking moths can talk to one another. You think that just boils up out of nothing? You think all we say is food and run? At some point, something, somewhere taught us to say nightmare, hope, hatred, and fuck you. These are unnatural thoughts, unbefitting of an animal, and yet you and I can fucking spit them with ease.
Hannah remembered a story her mother had told her. It wasn't a very good one, but it was one of the first she'd ever heard. It was one of a fox who went into the woods. He went there to find his forgotten name. Along the way, he met all kinds of friends, and they all helped him look for the name. Together, they looked over the stars, under the stones, and in the heart of a frozen giant. But nowhere did they find the name, no matter how hard they looked. Finally, the fox found solace in his many friends, but he always wondered what his true name might have been. But of course, Hannah knew. She knew the name all along. It was her name. And his. The image grabbed her, flinging her up against the wall. In her mind's eye, she saw herself walking the cobblestone streets of San Francisco as electric lights were being put up. She saw herself giving away her daughter, Samantha, at a wedding. She saw herself dressed for the rehearsal of a play. She saw countless early mornings as she shaved the face of a man growing old in the bathroom mirror. Finally, she saw a study, the flutter of two moths playing in the morning sun as her heart failed to beat. And then there was darkness, an endless, reachless void, an impenetrable veil, a night without stars. And in that space, something reached out to her, welcoming her. Something that had been there all along, teaching her to think, teaching her to read, teaching her to listen, to love, to hope, and to grieve. It was right there, the being that had brought word to the apes and taught them to live. And for the first time, someone came to his throne.
I see him.
Hannah muttered.
I'm feeling him.
The man in the burlap sack watched her writhe and contort, her body lifting itself into the air, struggling to break the chains, or her wrists, whatever came first. But Hannah knew nothing of the red flare or the slumped bodies. She saw it. It sat upon a veiled throne, prying over the abused of a gift, a moth for every man, woman, and child, a body of blackened hearts beating in unison, wailing for us to listen, for us to hear the words of those who wanted more, to do more, and who had their time cut short. But in the dark space of the in-between, there was no one else. Hannah coughed as her eyes rolled back. Her body was trying to physically look inwards, turning her eyes inside out. Streaks of blood rolled out of her nose as the spasms took hold.
The veiled throne cries for us to listen, to read the white of the lines.
She shrieked, chewing on her tongue.
We abuse the gift long given. We choose to forego and fade.
She turned her white eyes to the man in the burlap sack. The shadows of the room crept closer as the light of the flare started to die. It too remembered to listen. The walls remembered. The doors remembered. It was all coming back to a realization of a universal truth, long since forgotten. That information can be transferred infinitely, anywhere, and it can never die. All you need is to know the right words. The man in the burlap sack backed away, raising his pistol into the dark.
There is no one left to wander the halls of the void. You have abandoned him. You all abandoned our Lord.
The walls crept, curling the sheet metal like bad wallpaper. The chains wilted like autumn petals, falling away at her wrist, carried forth by a memory of an earth unbound. An unspoken word taught in the worlds beyond came to her, and from the throne an undulating form screamed in ecstasy. Finally, the one guest at his side would go to spread his truth. Finally. Hannah Blanchett screamed a single word, a word that summarized all that needed to be said into a single sound, forced into the world by a power beyond, a voice reaching through a mortal neck at the cost of a soul freely given. And the man in the burlap sack pulled the trigger. As the fourth prisoner slumped to the floor, the flare burned out. The man with the burlap sack tasted the words he'd heard, feeling them burned into his mind like a fresh tattoo. He removed his mask and stepped out of the room in a daze. He walked up the many flights of stairs that covered his lair and clutched his pistol tight, ignoring the stench of the extensive water damage. The night sky was clear and the air was crisp. The many stars above spoke of a truth beyond truths, a resting place for those who truly listened. He knew there was something out there, something that had once given us a way to speak across eons, a language that could bend the world and send us into sights unseen, for one to truly listen. As the man raised his pistol to his temple, he asked himself one final question.
Am I Emmett Rask?
And with the flutter of two moths playing in the night sky, he saw the answer, and no trigger was pulled. Hey, what's up? Your narrator here, and you heard a voice for the first time in this channel's history that wasn't mine. And the super cool thing is the one you heard was actually the author of this story, Saturdead, who is from the land of the moose. He's from Sweden, so that's where that wonderful accent was from, and it was super cool having him on. This is the first collaboration thing I've ever done, and it was really cool to have the author in their own story. I really enjoyed it, so I hope you also liked it. If you did, hit the only thumb button that works. Maybe hit that red button down there. Is it still red? I don't know, but yeah. Anyways, much love, much thanks. I'll see you in the next one. Ego Volt Anima Vestra.